What if everything you thought you knew about Meghan Markle's Hollywood comeback was completely wrong? What if her big return to acting, the moment her team has been teasing, polishing, hyping, and selling as her rebirth as a serious actress, actually began with the one thing every Hollywood director fears most: chaos? What if that chaos didn't come from a production delay, a malfunctioning camera, or a missing script page, but from Meghan herself? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's the question insiders at Amazon MGM Studios are whispering right now. And make no mistake, they're whispering, not shouting, because what allegedly went down inside Stage 14 of the Close Personal Friends set was so shocking, so disruptive, so wildly unexpected, that some staff still don't believe it happened. Others believe it changed the tone of the entire film. A few say it changed the tone of the entire studio. The story didn't leak in one big blast. No, it slipped out in fragments: a side comment from a lighting tech, a message from a shaken production assistant, a quiet remark from an actor who still seems afraid to attach their name to the situation. But the fragments all pointed to the same moment. A moment where Meghan Markle, former Duchess, aspiring Hollywood comeback star, reportedly arrived at Amazon MGM Studios with paparazzi in tow. With guards who stormed into the building like they owned it, with demands that stretched longer than the script she was supposed to perform, and with an attitude that, according to sources, collided head-on with a director who values quiet, respect, and discipline on set. And then the unthinkable happened. She was booed. Not by the public, not by Reddit trolls, not by angry Twitter users, by people on the actual set, people who work in the industry, people who rarely, if ever, show open frustration toward a talent, approved star or not. And according to multiple insiders, that was just the beginning. So the question is, how did we get here? How does a big studio like Amazon MGM, careful, calculated, PR-sensitive, end up in a situation where the actress meant to headline a film ends up escorted out of the building? To understand that, we have to rewind. But not too far, because all of this, every rumor, every whisper, every leaked message, it happened recently. In fact, some staff say their ears are still ringing from the commotion. This story matters now because Meghan's Hollywood trajectory hangs by a thread. This was supposed to be her moment, her clean slate, her re-entry into an industry she once walked away from. And when Amazon MGM Studios announced Close Personal Friends, insiders say they genuinely believe they were giving her a chance. Not a charity gesture, but a calculated risk with the possibility of turning public sentiment around. Yet it didn't take long before that risk started to look more like a structural crack. A crack that spread. A crack that staff tried to cover with professionalism and politeness. A crack that eventually split wide open. Picture this. The cast arrives early in the morning, coffee in hand, script pages tucked under their arms, ready for the first full day where every major actor is present. The vibe is calm. The energy is focused. Director Jason Orley is known for running an efficient, laid-back set, not overly strict, not authoritarian, but controlled, respectful, collaborative. People were smiling. You know that quiet optimism a set has on day one when things finally start feeling real? That was the atmosphere. But around 9:47 a.m., according to one crew member, the first sign of trouble appeared. A group of unfamiliar men dressed in black stepped into the hallway. No one announced them. No one checked them in. No one even knew which department they belonged to. But they moved like they owned the place, like their job wasn't to blend in, but to dominate the room. Someone actually asked, "Are we expecting Secret Service?" It was a joke, but not really. And then another staffer noticed something else. Outside the studio gates, a crowd was gathering. Not fans, photographers, paparazzi. Now, here's the thing. Big studios aren't strangers to paparazzi. They know how to manage press. They even invite them when strategically beneficial. But this wasn't strategic, and it certainly wasn't coordinated. These weren't press badges or sanction shots. These were long lenses, whispered instructions, and flashes attempting to pierce through the tinted studio gates. And within 5 minutes, whispers started spreading inside the building. Who tipped them off? Why are they here? Did someone leak the filming location? But those questions didn't linger long. Because within another few minutes, somebody accidentally let slip that the paparazzi weren't there by coincidence. Someone from Meghan's own circle allegedly contacted them with exact arrival times. And that revelation hit the crew like an aftershock. But even that wasn't the spark that ignited the room. No, the spark came the moment Meghan Markle herself stepped inside the soundstage. According to witnesses, she didn't slip in quietly. She didn't arrive like an actor prepared to work. She arrived like an event, like a moment created for cameras. Some staff even said she walked in the way a red carpet host enters an award show, back straight, chin lifted, a face that said she knew cameras were capturing every second. Except they weren't, because camera phones were banned on set, which meant the only people she was performing for were the people she had just disrupted. The room went stiff. Her team followed her like an entourage, which industry veterans say was bizarre. Most actors, even A-listers, don't show up with that many people for an interior studio day. It throws off the rhythm. It disrupts the concentration. And the tension built so fast that some actors described it as suffocating. Then it happened, the moment no one expected. From the far side of the stage, a cluster of background actors and crew reacted. At first a murmur, then a louder sound, then a sudden, unmistakable wave. Booing. Booing on a professional film set. Do you know how rare that is? How extreme things must be for working professionals. People trained to remain neutral, polite, disciplined, to actually react like that. Some crew members said they immediately looked at the director to see what he would do. Others said they simply froze. As for Meghan, insiders say her expression shifted instantly. Shock, offense, confusion, maybe even disbelief. Because this wasn't a crowd of British protesters or anonymous online critics. This was her industry, her peers, people who had no reason to boo unless something had reached a breaking point. And here's the twist. The booing wasn't about her acting. She hadn't even rehearsed yet. It was about the disruption, the intrusion, the feeling that the set had become secondary to her entrance. But Meghan didn't leave. She stood her ground. Her guards widened their stance. And the atmosphere went from uncomfortable to unstable. Yet even then, the day was far from over. In fact, the booing wasn't even the most shocking part. Things escalated. Tiny incidents piled on each other like unstable dominoes, each one pushing the next one closer to collapse. There were whispered complaints about demands she allegedly made within minutes of arriving. One staff member said she tried to adjust the lighting mid-rehearsal. Another claimed she asked to have her scene partner repositioned for better angles. Someone else said she tried to rewrite lines on the spot. Lines Jason Orley had finalized weeks earlier. And through all of this, the paparazzi outside kept snapping. Every flash was another reminder. This wasn't a film shoot anymore. It was a spectacle nobody signed up for. But here's the thing the public didn't know. The one detail insiders say was the final straw. After hours of tension, disruption, delays, and confrontations, the executives made a decision. A decision that would echo through Hollywood. A decision that even seasoned crew members say they've never witnessed in their careers. They asked her to leave. Escorted. Removed. Taken out of the building. But as unbelievable as that sounds, insiders swear something even more shocking happened the moment she stepped into the hallway. A moment no one predicted. A moment that made the first wave of booing look tame. And we're about to dive into that moment, but not yet. Because before we get to the confrontation, before we unpack the chaos that followed, and before we reveal the biggest twist of the entire day, we have to go back to the very beginning of the incident timeline and break down exactly how the set fell apart. Piece by piece, moment by moment, like forensic reconstruction. Because once you see how it all unfolded, the ending will make a lot more sense. And it all starts with the calm before the storm. The part everyone forgot, the part no one talks about, the part that reveals exactly why the room reacted the way it did. But what happened next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Not a gentle flicker, not a subtle glimmer bouncing off a wall. No, this was a violent burst of white-hot light that cut straight through the room like a blade. And it didn't come from a studio camera. It didn't come from a controlled lighting rig or a behind-the-scenes photographer hired to document the day. It came from outside, from a lens pointed through the narrow gap between the studio gate and the outer fence. And when that flash hit the wall, bouncing off metal fixtures and polished floors, everyone on the soundstage froze. Not because they were scared, because they were confused. Very confused. Hollywood sets don't tolerate flashing lights from the outside world. It's not allowed. It's not normal. And when it does happen, it's usually the result of one of two things, a mistake or a breach. Except this wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't a breach. It was intentional, aimed, timed, coordinated. Someone wanted that moment captured. And all eyes turned to Meghan. Not because she had done anything yet, but because the flash happened at the exact second she stepped into the studio. What are the odds of that? Ask yourself honestly. What are the chances that paparazzi would magically time a flash to hit the room at the precise moment Meghan Markle, not the director, not the lead actor, not the producers, walked through the door? Crew members later said they felt an electric wave pass through everyone present. A script supervisor whispered, "Is someone photographing us?" A grip muttered, "Who the hell even knows we're filming today?" A member of the lighting team sighed and said, "This isn't going to be good." And just like that, the production rhythm collapsed. Because once the first flash appeared, the second wasn't far behind. Another burst. Another angle. Another pop of light sneaking in from a crack in the exterior gates. Not one, not two, but multiple, each brighter than the last. And with each flash, more crew members stopped what they were doing. Actors lowered their scripts. The assistant director pulled off his headset. Jason Orley looked up with an expression that one insider described as calm irritation married to pure dread. Meanwhile, Meghan stood in the center of the chaos, guards at her sides, assistant behind her, and a look that several crew members described as strangely expectant. Like she had been waiting for that moment. Like she wanted that flash. Like she wasn't surprised at all. But the crew was. And they weren't impressed. Because here's what most people don't understand. Actors hate paparazzi on set. They hate anything that disrupts their ability to focus, to rehearse, to build chemistry, to disappear into a character. A set is supposed to feel like a protected environment. A bubble. A world within a world. When that bubble bursts, even for a second, the emotional tone resets. And not in a good way. That morning, the bubble didn't just burst. It shattered. Because paparazzi weren't just outside. They were multiplying. More arrived in cars, parking illegally on side streets. A few climbed the low brick wall near the east lot. Others gathered behind dumpsters across the road. All of them pointed their cameras toward one person. Not the cast, not the location, not the production crew. Just Meghan. And Meghan alone. Which is strange, right? Why would an upcoming Amazon MGM film that had been kept so secret suddenly attract paparazzi from 3 different agencies? And why would they all arrive within the same 10-minute window? Unless someone sent them a message. Unless someone gave them a schedule. Unless someone wanted her entrance documented. Some crew members suspected it immediately. Others didn't want to believe it. But when a production assistant's phone buzzed with a message from another coworker stationed outside, the truth became harder to ignore. "Dude, the paps are literally saying she told them to come." That message spread like poison through the crew. And suddenly, the entire set felt like an audience to a performance they didn't want tickets to. Paparazzi pressed against the gates, shouting Meghan's name, trying to get her attention, trying to snap the perfect comeback photo. But when Meghan didn't acknowledge them, they began shouting louder. "Meghan, look this way. Turn your head. Give us the smile. Look over your shoulder." But something didn't add up for the crew watching her. Meghan didn't look bothered. She didn't look confused. She didn't look upset. She looked rehearsed. Poised, postured, prepared, and something else caught the director's attention, something the outside world never saw. Whenever a flash went off, Meghan adjusted her body position ever so slightly. Just an inch, just a tilt, just enough to open her profile toward the gate. Not enough for the average eye to notice, but enough for people trained to work with cameras to see immediately. Because actors who work in TV and film know how to find their light instinctively. They know how to turn toward a lens. They know how to position themselves so that a photo captures their best angles. But they do not do that during rehearsals. They do not do that between takes. They do not do that while entering a building for the first day of work. That kind of posing only happens during press events, red carpets, interviews, public appearances. Not here. Not now. Which is why the crew exchanged glances. And those glances said everything. Something wasn't right. Then things got worse. Studio security began scrambling outside, instructing paparazzi to leave the premises, but they refused. They stayed as close to the gates as legally possible. They shouted louder. They snapped faster. They circled the perimeter looking for better angles. And Meghan? She didn't address the situation. She didn't ask her team to intervene. She didn't look surprised, disappointed, or caught off guard. She simply walked forward, deeper into the soundstage, as though this chaos were an expected part of her day. And that's when Jason Orley, calm, patient, famously unflappable Jason Orley, reacted. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't confront Meghan. He walked over to the assistant director and asked one quiet question. Who made that call? He meant the call that alerted the paparazzi. But no one could answer. No one admitted to knowing. No one took responsibility. And no one believed it was an accident. Because 15 minutes after Meghan arrived, another thing happened, something even stranger. One of the background actors, scrolling through his phone during a break, spotted something online. A tweet. A tweet from an anonymous paparazzi account that had posted, "Wait for this. Meghan's exact arrival time at Amazon MGM Studios, 20 minutes before she even reached the building." How? How would someone outside the studio know the exact minute she would arrive? Even the director didn't know her precise arrival time until she walked into the hallway. But someone tipped off the press. Someone gave them the intel. Someone told them when to show up. And that meant one thing. This wasn't accidental publicity. This wasn't opportunistic paparazzi. This was orchestrated. But by whom? That question hung in the air like smoke. And staff members weren't the only ones asking it. Actors began whispering. Producers exchanged worried looks. Wardrobes stopped their prep because they didn't know if they'd need to retime the schedule again. Everything stopped. Everything stalled. Everything shifted. The film wasn't filming anymore. It was surviving, trying to breathe through the chaos, trying to remain professional while distractions swarmed outside like wasps. And the energy of the entire day changed in one instant. The moment someone found the messages. This part wasn't public. This part didn't leak online. This part was only known by the crew inside that building. But it was the moment that confirmed every suspicion. One of Meghan's assistants, the same assistant who walked into the building before her, had been spotted messaging someone outside through WhatsApp. And the timing of those messages? Perfectly aligned with the paparazzi arrival. At least 2 crew members later claimed they overheard part of the conversation. Things like, "They're here. She's walking in now. This is the moment." But even if those quotes weren't word for word, the implications were clear. The assistant was coordinating something. And it wasn't for the film. From that second on, the crew wasn't just irritated. They were angry. Because they realized something that no actor ever wants to admit. The set was being used. Not for art. Not for collaboration. Not for storytelling. For an image. For a photo op. For a headline. And that realization triggered the shift that eventually led to the booing later that day. Because respect is the currency on set. And in those first few minutes, respect was already bankrupt. But the moment that solidified everyone's feelings wasn't the paparazzi or the flashes or the whispers. It was Jason Orley himself. He walked into the center of the room, stared at the gate, and then quietly said, "This can't happen again." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The worst emotion a director can feel on a film's opening day. But that disappointment quickly turned into something else. Because a few minutes later, a sound echoed through the hallway that sent everyone spinning. A single, sharp, piercing voice from outside the gate shouting, "Meghan, give us a smile before you go in." And for the first time all morning, Meghan reacted. She paused. She turned. Just slightly. Just enough. And that tiny moment, that tiny hesitation, that tiny acknowledgement, was all it took for the crew to understand the truth they didn't want to believe. The paparazzi weren't the problem. They were the plan. But the real chaos hadn't even started yet. Because while the outside world was fighting for a photo, something far more explosive was brewing inside the building. Something involving guards. Something involving blocked hallways. Something involving cast members losing their patience. Something involving the moment the crew finally snapped. And it all begins the second Meghan's private security stepped into the frame, literally and figuratively. Because once the guards appeared, the situation collapsed into full disruption. What happened next would turn confusion into outrage, tension into confrontation, and whispers into a full-blown meltdown. But before we get there, You need to see what those guards did when they entered the set, because that moment changed everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the WhatsApp messages surfaced, everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly. Because up until that moment, the crew still had hope, faint hope, that all the chaos erupting around Meghan's arrival was just a misunderstanding, a coincidence, a bad morning, a logistical hiccup that would settle once everyone got into position and the cameras started rolling. But the messages killed that hope, completely, swiftly, with one undeniable blow. And here's the shocking part. They weren't even supposed to be seen. They were accidental. Accidental, but incriminating. Let's rewind to the exact second it happened. A production assistant. Not a senior one, not someone with authority, just a mid-level PA who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, saw one of Meghan's personal team members step into a quiet corner of the hallway. The assistant was typing fast, glancing over their shoulder, clearly trying to stay low profile. But they weren't careful enough. Because when the PA walked by, the phone screen was tilted just enough for him to see 2 lines of a WhatsApp chat popping up on the display. 2 lines that hit him like a punch to the gut. They're in position. Get ready for entry. 2 lines. 10 words. But they told the entire story. And that's when the PA froze. Do you know that feeling when you stumble on something you weren't supposed to see? Something that snaps a puzzle into place before you even realize you're holding the final piece? That's what he described later. And before he could walk away, another message appeared. Send the second car now. At first he thought maybe it was about vehicles outside the studio. But then a third message appeared, the one that confirmed everything beyond any doubt. Make sure they capture the first step. She'll pause. Pause. Pause for what? Pause for who? There was only one answer. Not for the film. Not for the director. Not for the crew. For the cameras outside. The paparazzi. And in that moment, the PA understood what nearly everyone inside the building had been afraid to admit. The chaos wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't the unfortunate outcome of a busy morning. It was staged, designed, engineered, executed. Now stop and think about that for a second. Imagine you're a crew member on a major film. You've been hired to work a serious production under a respected director. You're there to build something real, a film with emotional depth, comedic timing, dramatic weight. And suddenly you realize the schedule is being hijacked, not for storytelling, not for filmmaking, but for a publicity stunt. How would you feel? Disrespected? Used? Manipulated? Crew members later described the moment the messages surfaced as a collective emotional snap. A breaking point. A line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. But the plot thickens. Because the PA didn't keep the discovery to himself. He didn't scream. He didn't confront Meghan's assistant. He didn't make a scene. He did what Hollywood professionals do. He whispered. One whispered to another PA, who whispered to a makeup artist, who whispered to a lighting tech, who whispered to someone in wardrobe, who whispered to a camera operator. Within minutes, the entire left half of the soundstage had heard about the messages. And everything, absolutely everything, shifted. The whispers turned into murmurs. The murmurs turned into glances. The glances turned into sideways stares directed at Meghan's team. And then came the anger. Not dramatic, explosive anger. Not shouting or slamming equipment. Worse, professional anger. The silent, razor-sharp kind that grows beneath the surface until it becomes impossible to contain. Because nothing infuriates Hollywood crews more than time being wasted. They're trained to optimize every second of the day, because time is money, and film time is expensive. Every delay, every disruption, every interruption costs thousands of dollars. And they realized Meghan wasn't just late. She wasn't just dramatic. She wasn't just arriving with pomp. She was using the studio, using them, as props. And the director was watching it happen. Jason Orley had already grown tense watching the paparazzi swarm outside the gate. He had already clenched his jaw when the flashes invaded the set. He had already observed Meghan pose in a way that didn't make sense for an actress arriving at work. But when the whispers reached him about the messages, one insider described his reaction in one word. Defeated. Not angry, not shocked. Defeated. Because he knew what it meant. He knew that his set, his carefully structured, meticulously planned, professionally run environment, had been compromised before he even said action for the first scene. He knew everything he built was now under threat. He knew respect had already crumbled. And he also knew something else. A divided crew is dangerous. When a crew turns against an actor, chaos follows. Moods shift. Efficiency drops. Patience evaporates. Even the most professional workers become distracted by emotion. And the cracks were already widening. The lighting department began delaying their rig. The sound team paused their calibrations. The assistant directors stopped adjusting the scene boards. People weren't working anymore. They were reacting. And the reaction intensified when someone else confirmed the WhatsApp leak. A background actor, waiting in the hallway, bored, scrolling through his phone, overheard Meghan's assistant whispering on a voice note. Not loudly, not obnoxiously, but just loud enough to catch a few chilling phrases. They're waiting. She wants the first shot. She'll stop by the door. Make sure they're ready. Make sure they're ready? Who talks like that on a film set? Not directors. Not producers. Not legitimate PR teams. Only one type of person uses language like that. Someone coordinating a photo op. Then came the message that sealed the crew's fury. A fourth WhatsApp bubble popped up. Tell them to yell her name, so she turns. Yell her name, so she turns. That was the moment one actress reportedly lost her composure. She threw her script down on a nearby table and muttered loudly enough for half the room to hear. This isn't a set. It's a circus. A circus. And Meghan wasn't the ringmaster. She was the attraction. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because this wasn't just about distraction anymore. This was about safety. When paparazzi congregate outside a studio, it creates hazards. Cars block entrances. Crew members struggle to move equipment. Unlicensed photographers climb structures, fences, and walls. They shout unexpectedly. They run into moving vehicles. They trigger crowd surges. Directors hate it. Studios fear it. Insurance policies panic. And that morning, the paparazzi were growing louder, more aggressive, more impatient. Snapping, yelling, jostling for position. One of them even shouted, "We see you in the doorway. Give us something." But Meghan wasn't even in the doorway. Not yet. So who were they talking to? The only explanation. They had been fed a script. And that means someone connected to Meghan, was in communication with them outside. But the story doesn't end there. Because the most explosive detail wasn't the messages themselves. It was what happened after they were shared. A lighting tech marched straight to the assistant director and whispered, "You need to see this. We've got a situation." The AD looked at the screen. His face fell. He nodded once, then walked straight toward Jason Orley. That's when insiders say Orley made a decision. A quiet decision. A heavy decision. A decision that would lay the groundwork for everything that followed. The confrontation, the booing, the removal. He told the AD to lock down the set. Full lockdown. Only essential personnel. All extra access revoked. All unnecessary movement restricted. But you know who doesn't follow lockdown rules? People who don't believe the rules apply to them. Because seconds after the lockdown order was whispered through the earpiece system, Meghan's guards walked in. Not one, not two, not three. A wall of them. All dressed in black. All carrying radios. All moving like they owned the entire building. And when they stepped into the soundstage, everything, absolutely everything, imploded. But before we get to that chaos, before we unravel the confrontation that shook the set, before we explore how one actress nearly walked out, and how one crew member burst into tears, and how Orley himself reached his breaking point, we need to talk about the single moment that turned irritation into outrage. The moment someone confronted Meghan's assistant. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was simple. A crew member walked up and quietly asked, "Did you call the paparazzi?" The assistant froze. Didn't answer. Didn't deny it. Just froze. Then turned away. And that, according to people in the room, was the spark. The spark that ignited everything. The spark that turned the crew against Meghan. The spark that transformed tension into hostility. The spark that pushed the director to take action. Because the next thing that happened wasn't an accident. It was a direct consequence of those messages. A direct reaction to the manipulation. A direct response to the chaos. The crew booed. But what triggered that boo, that breaking moment, is tied directly to the next chapter. Because the real storm didn't begin with paparazzi, or WhatsApp, or whispers. It began the second Meghan's guards stepped onto the set and blocked the hallway, the entrances, the equipment paths, and even the actors themselves, turning a functioning film set into a controlled security perimeter. What they did next, that's when all hell broke loose. And no one, not even Meghan, was prepared for what happened. The moment the guards walked onto the set, everything stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. Actors stopped mid-sentence. A sound technician froze with a boom pole halfway raised. A makeup artist paused her brush in midair. Even the assistant director, usually the calmest, steadiest presence in the chaos of filmmaking, took a step back like someone had just pushed a cold gust of wind through the room. Because these were not normal security guards. Not the kind studios hire. Not the kind actors occasionally bring along for discretion. Not the subtle, quietly professional type who stand in the background. No, these men moved like they had been trained for something intense. Something tactical. Something far beyond film set protocol. They moved in formation, sweeping the hallway as if preparing a building for a VIP head of state, not an actress returning to Hollywood after a decade away. And that was the problem. Their presence wasn't just distracting. It was aggressive. A wall of black suits, earpieces, and heavy footsteps marching through the studio like they owned the place. Now imagine this from the perspective of the cast. You're here to act. You're here to rehearse. You're here to focus. And suddenly, men you don't know, men who aren't part of the production, men who have no badges, no clearance, no studio authority, are standing between you and your marks, between you and your scene partners, between you and your director. A nightmare. One actor said later, it felt like being at a film shoot inside a political rally. Another said, they were everywhere. Everywhere except where they actually belonged. Let's go back to the exact second the first guard stepped into the soundstage. He didn't knock. He didn't identify himself. He didn't wait for permission. He simply walked in. A silent, looming presence taking up physical and emotional space. And right behind him came 3 more. Then 2 more. Then another. By the time Meghan entered, at least 8 guards had formed a loose perimeter around the room. Picture that. 8 men, dressed in black, moving like a synchronized security unit. In a room full of creatives holding scripts, makeup brushes, costume racks, and headsets. It made no sense. None. Even A-list actors don't bring that many guards onto a working set. Not The Rock. Not Meryl Streep. Not Zendaya. Not Robert Downey Jr. Not Angelina Jolie. Nobody. Because film sets have one golden rule. Don't disrupt the work. And this was disruption incarnate. Now remember what happened at the end of the previous chapter. The crew had just discovered the WhatsApp leak. They had just realized paparazzi hadn't shown up by chance. They had just pieced together that Meghan's arrival was orchestrated with camera-friendly precision. Tension was already building, and the guards were gasoline poured directly over that flame. The moment they spread out across the room, the atmosphere turned suffocating. A script supervisor tried to walk past one of them to reach her station. He blocked her. She pointed to her headset. He still didn't move. She tried again, gently squeezing between 2 of them. One placed a hand near her shoulder, not touching, but close enough to make the message clear. Don't. That was the first moment the crew snapped. A nearby grips manager shouted, "Hey, you can't do that. She works here." But the guards didn't react. They didn't flinch. They stood like statues. One actor whispered to another, "Why are they behaving like we're threats?" Another muttered, "Is she expecting an attack? What is this?" No answers. Just tension. Rising. Thickening. Wrapping itself around every person in the room. Then, like an echo traveling down the hallway, something else happened. More footsteps. Heavier ones. And suddenly, the guards stepped aside. Not for the director, not for a producer, not for studio executives. But for Meghan. This was her grand entrance. Not subtle. Not respectful. Not in tune with the energy of a professional set. It was a spectacle. And according to multiple staff members, she walked in with the composure of someone expecting applause. But she received something else. Silence. Stunned, uncomfortable silence. Because everyone in that room had just watched their workplace, normally governed by rules, hierarchy, and safety protocols, get overridden by a spectacle that had nothing to do with filmmaking. Meghan didn't apologize for the disruption. She didn't acknowledge the chaos outside. She didn't explain the guards' behavior. She didn't break the tension. She just stepped in like she owned the space. Then, another twist. Her guards began adjusting things. Yes, adjusting the set. One guard moved a chair that was taped to the floor. Another shifted a lighting screen out of the way so he could position himself at a better angle. Another leaned over a prop table and shoved items aside so he could stand closer to Meghan. A props manager gasped and said, "Hey, that's placed for continuity." The guard turned his head slowly and stared. Just stared. The props manager backed away. And that was only the beginning. Because actors need space to rehearse. Camera operators need clear paths to move equipment. Lighting technicians need exact, consistent placement to keep a scene visually coherent. But Meghan's security didn't care. They blocked walkways. They blocked entrances. They blocked camera movement. They blocked the actors' marks. They even blocked the assistant director at one point. Now ask yourself, how would you react if you were a professional trying to work while someone else's guards acted like they owned the building? Would you get irritated? Would you get defensive? Would you get angry? So did the crew, especially when one guard crossed the biggest line of all. A boom operator, who holds the long microphone pole over the actors, needed to get into position for audio rehearsal. His job is already physically demanding. You have to hover the microphone above the frame line, hold your arms up for minutes at a time, follow movement, and avoid shadows. He stepped forward. A guard stepped in his way. The operator tried to sidestep. The guard mirrored him. He tried again. Blocked again. Finally, the operator said, "I have to get to the actors. Let me through." And the guard replied, in a cold, clipped tone, "Not until she's settled." She meant Meghan, not the director. Not the film. Not the rehearsal schedule. Her. That was the moment the sound team nearly mutinied. One audio engineer whispered loudly, "This is ridiculous." Another muttered, "Is this a film set or a royal procession?" And remember, this was all before Meghan even opened her mouth. But the most intense reaction came from the actors. Because actors rely on emotional safety. They need vulnerability. They need space. They need freedom of movement. And suddenly, that freedom was gone. One actor tried to walk toward the center of the room to rehearse her lines. A guard stepped into her path. She blinked, confused. "I'm supposed to go there." He shook his head. "You'll wait." Wait. Wait for what? Wait for who? She wasn't waiting for the director's cue. She wasn't waiting for the assistant director's signal. She was being told to wait for Meghan. That wasn't just disrespect. It was humiliating. And humiliation is the fastest way to ignite resentment on a set. The actor turned around, walked back to her castmates, and whispered, "I'm done. I'm seriously done." Another actor clenched his jaw so tightly that a makeup artist asked if he needed water. This moment, according to multiple insiders, was the spark that transformed irritation into hostility. But Meghan didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she noticed, but didn't care. She walked past the crew, straight to her mark, surrounded by a protective circle of guards. And the moment she stopped walking, her guards fanned out like she was a headliner at a concert preparing for pyrotechnics. Except this wasn't a concert. This wasn't a red carpet. This wasn't a political rally. This was a film set. A workplace. But it didn't feel like one anymore. Meghan's presence, combined with her guards, her assistants' messages, the paparazzi outside, turned the set into something unrecognizable. And the tension in the room thickened again. Thicker. Heavier. Bordering on explosive. Then, without warning, one of the guards walked directly in front of a camera lens and stood there, completely blocking the frame. A camera operator shouted, "Hey, you're in my shot." The guard didn't move. The operator tried again. Nothing. Finally, the operator raised his voice. "You need to move. We're trying to work here." And the guard turned, slowly, deliberately, and replied, "We're not done securing the area." Securing the area? From what? From who? From the professional crew members trying to do their jobs? The room erupted into whispers. What is happening? Why are they acting like this? This is insane. She's not the president. She's an actress. The director finally stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "this is a controlled workspace. You cannot obstruct equipment. You cannot block cast or crew. You must move aside." It was the first real moment of authority all morning. But the guards didn't respond. They just stared back at him. Tense silence. Crew members held their breath. Silence shattered. Not softly. Not politely. Not a whisper of dissent that could be ignored. It erupted like an explosion. A sudden, sharp, undeniable roar that made heads spin, scripts drop, and even the guards hesitate mid-step. Booing. Yes, actual booing. On a professional film set. The words barely seemed real. Staff froze. Actors blinked in disbelief. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others immediately realized it wasn't. It was loud. It was directed. And it was unanimous. The sound came first from a cluster of background actors. Low at first, murmured under their breath, then growing louder as more crew joined in. And it spread like wildfire. By the time Meghan stepped fully onto the soundstage, it seemed everyone present. Camera operators, grips, costume assistants, and even some producers had joined in. Do you know what it's like to witness that kind of rebellion on set? To see dozens of professionals, people trained to be polite, trained to handle the whims of stars, openly defy someone in real time? That's what those moments felt like to the insiders. According to multiple sources, the booing didn't happen because of her acting. She hadn't said a word. Not yet. It happened because of the disruption. The intrusion. The feeling that, in that moment, the set no longer belonged to the crew or the actors or even the director. It belonged to her. And the crew knew it. Imagine hours of whispered warnings. Messages exposing coordination with paparazzi outside. Guards moving like a tactical unit across a space that wasn't theirs. Equipment blocked. Hallways controlled. Timing manipulated. Actors forced to pause and wait. The cumulative pressure built to a point that words could no longer contain it. And then came the moment someone finally voiced the collective frustration. Seriously? Are we filming or hosting a parade? It was a background actor, young, relatively new to professional sets, but fearless enough to speak. And it sparked a chain reaction. A grip muttered under his breath, "We've worked with A-list stars before. Never been treated like this." A camera assistant added, "It's a circus, and we're the clowns." An older wardrobe technician snapped, "I'm done bending over backwards for someone who doesn't even respect us." And then the first audible boo came from one of the supporting actors. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't targeted at her personally. It was exasperation. It was shock. It was a visceral reaction to cumulative chaos. But here's the thing about exasperation. It spreads fast. Within seconds, more crew members joined. Some laughed nervously as if to lighten the mood. Others shouted with genuine frustration. The sound amplified as it echoed through the studio, bouncing off walls, across props tables, over partially set lighting rigs. And Meghan froze. For the first time that day, she paused. Her calm, practiced composure faltered. Staff later said she tilted her head, scanning the room. One insider described the moment as her realization that this wasn't a photo op. This was reality. And reality didn't love her. And it wasn't just her reaction that mattered. The guards stiffened. They tightened their formation, blocking paths, scanning faces. But even their presence couldn't contain the noise. Not when dozens of people had reached a breaking point. Some crew members claim they'd never seen anything like it. Not on sets with diva stars, not with notoriously difficult A-listers, not even with chaotic first-day shoots. This was a new level of revolt. And then the whispers started. Whispers about the WhatsApp messages, about the timing of paparazzi flashes, about the orchestration that had led to this moment, about how the arrival that was supposed to be celebrated as a comeback had instead become a disruption nightmare. It's not the acting. It's the control, one camera operator said. She's manipulating the entire environment, another whispered. They aren't even filming yet. And it's already a disaster, a PA muttered. The collective tension was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark was Meghan herself. She finally spoke. A short sentence. Polished. Controlled. Can we adjust the lighting? This is too harsh for my angle. The simplicity of it, so innocuous, made it worse. It wasn't apologetic. It wasn't empathetic. It didn't acknowledge the disruption, the chaos, the frustration. It was a single, precise request. And in the context of the chaos around her, it sounded like arrogance. Like entitlement. Like obliviousness to the atmosphere she herself had created. The crew couldn't help themselves. The murmurs grew louder. The whispers became audible commentary. The boos swelled. And that's when it escalated. One of the grips, frustrated at having his path blocked repeatedly by Meghan's guards, shouted, "Move aside. We're trying to work here." Another voice joined in. "This is ridiculous. She's not the only one in this room." It snowballed. Within moments, the entire soundstage had erupted in unified frustration. Professionals who were normally composed were openly expressing outrage. And in the middle of it all, Meghan remained poised, still protected by her personal security, still surrounded by her entourage, still unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, of the cumulative effect of her presence on the room. Do you see what happened here? This wasn't just a disruption. This wasn't just chaos. This was rebellion. A spontaneous uprising on a professional set. A revolt fueled by frustration, confusion, and sheer disbelief. And yet, paradoxically, it was still contained. Not by diplomacy, not by persuasion, not by anyone telling the crew to calm down. No, it was contained because of fear. Fear of escalation, fear of confrontation, fear of repercussions if anyone actually physically challenged the guards or Meghan herself. Which brings us to the next critical detail. Because while the booing was shocking, loud, and unprecedented, insiders say it was nothing compared to the undercurrent that followed. The moment someone in the back of the room yelled, "We're not here to be your props," the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just audible protest anymore. It was emotional exposure. Everyone could feel the collective tension, the resentment, the disbelief. And if you think that kind of energy can be ignored, think again. On a film set, emotional energy is contagious. It flows through the room. It impacts performance. It impacts decision-making. It impacts safety. And right at that moment, the director, Jason Orley, knew the stakes had changed completely. He wasn't just managing a set anymore. He was managing a rebellion. A rebellion triggered by a combination of factors. The WhatsApp messages, the paparazzi, the guards, Meghan's controlled poise, and finally the culmination, her first words. And it was escalating fast. By 9:55 a.m., staff later recalled, there was a palpable hum of tension, like the air itself had thickened. Whispers were no longer whispers. Conversations were clipped. Some actors were pacing. Some crew members were holding their heads in their hands. The energy in the room wasn't just frustration. It was chaos. But remember, this is just the beginning. Because what happened next? The escalation beyond booze, the confrontation between Meghan and Jason Orley, the actions that forced the studio executives to intervene, was far more explosive. And it would eventually lead to an outcome that no one on set ever expected. What happened next would test every rule of professionalism, patience, and control. And when it came to the moment the studio made its first intervention, the fallout would be seen and felt for the rest of the day. Because the scene was set. The audience was ready, and Meghan's next move would ignite it all. The entire room felt the standoff. Finally, one guard stepped back, but only a half step, as if to say, "We're cooperating on our terms." Jason Orley exhaled. The crew exhaled with him. But that fragile sense of order wouldn't last long. Because just when people thought things couldn't get worse, Meghan opened her mouth. She hadn't addressed the crowd. She hadn't acknowledged the disruption. She hadn't apologized or tried to smooth things over. Instead, she said one sentence. A sentence that would ignite the room even further. "Can we get better lighting? This is too harsh on my angle." Better lighting. On her angle, no mention of the crew's frustration. No effort to calm the room. No leadership. No humility. Just a lighting tweak. For her. While everyone else was simmering. And right then, something broke. You could feel it. Something in the room cracked like glass under pressure. Because the lighting team had spent the entire morning scrambling due to paparazzi interference, schedule changes, and corridors being blocked by security. And now, the very person causing the chaos was instructing them to redo their work. One lighting tech whispered to another, "Is she serious right now?" Another muttered, "We're not here for her personal photo shoot." The anger was growing loud enough for people to hear. And Meghan's guards? They stiffened. One stepped forward as if anticipating conflict. But the conflict didn't come from the lighting team. It came from the entire room. One sharp sound echoed through the soundstage. A scoff. Then another. Then low murmurs. Then louder whispers. People were reaching their breaking point. And that breaking point was inches away. Because the final straw, the moment that pushed the entire crew from frustration to outright revolt, was only seconds away. And when it hit, it would shake the room. Because in the next chapter, the booing begins. Not from outsiders. Not from trolls. Not from random critics. but from the very professionals Meghan needed on her side. And once the booing started, there was no going back. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly sensed something was about to go wrong? Not because anything bad had happened yet, but because the air felt off. Heavy, too quiet, too still, like the calm surface of water right before lightning slices through the sky. That's exactly how multiple crew members described the morning Meghan Markle arrived at Amazon MGM Studios for her first major day on the set of the film Close Personal Friends. People always imagine Hollywood sets as chaotic by default. Non-stop shouting, equipment clattering, stressed-out assistants sprinting from one crisis to the next. But that's not how director Jason Orley works. He's known for a different kind of environment. One that feels almost like a library with cameras. Soft voices. Light footsteps. Clear communication. Respect for everyone in the room, from interns to A-list leads. But that morning, according to sources inside the building, something subtle started shifting hours before Meghan even showed up. And it began with one small detail. Silence. Not peaceful silence. Tense silence. Quiet where quiet shouldn't be. A production assistant told a friend later that the silence felt too clean, like someone had wiped the natural energy out of the air. Actors were running lines, but doing it in hushed tones. Wardrobe staff moved with a strange stiffness. Even the usual early morning crew banter had faded. Everyone was waiting for something. Or rather, someone. Let's rewind to around 7:15 a.m., when the first wave of crew clocked in. People were upbeat, sipping coffee, flipping script pages, exchanging updates. They knew Meghan Markle was scheduled for her first major rehearsal, but they weren't expecting anything dramatic. Sure, she was a former royal. Sure, she had a reputation for being polarizing. But on a film set, reputation only matters for a few minutes. After that, people judge you solely by how you behave on the job, and everyone expected professionalism. In fact, insiders say that early in the morning, some staff were actually optimistic. A few were curious to see how she'd perform on camera after years away from acting. Some hoped she might surprise them. Especially since Amazon MGM had high stakes riding on the film. But the very first red flag wasn't Meghan. It wasn't her team. It wasn't paparazzi. It wasn't even the guards. It was the schedule. Because for reasons that weren't explained to the crew, the assistant director received a late-night directive to reorganize the entire rehearsal layout. Scene placements shifted. Movement paths changed. The first camera setup was delayed. Lighting prep had to be rebalanced. At first, people assumed it was a simple logistical correction. But then another note came through. Stage 14 must be partially cleared. Cleared? For what? Who? That's when the speculation started. A makeup artist whispered that perhaps the studio planned a surprise visit from an executive. A camera operator joked that maybe the lead actor had suddenly become allergic to people. Others wondered whether a high-profile investor was coming through. Nobody considered Meghan yet. Not until the walkie-talkies crackled with a message most staffers didn't understand at the time. Security sweep requested in Corridor B. No one ever requests a full corridor sweep unless something unusual is about to happen. Even major studio heads don't demand that level of clearance unless they're walking through with someone sensitive, powerful, or unpredictable. So crew members exchanged confused looks, but said nothing. Hollywood rule number 1. Don't ask questions you don't need the answer to. But confusion grew when a separate call followed. All windows on the east-facing side must remain shielded. Shielded? For privacy? From what? This wasn't a red carpet event. This wasn't a political rally. This wasn't a documentary. This was rehearsals. By 8:05 a.m., the whispers were no longer whispers. Something, or someone, was definitely coming. And here's the funny part. The cast wasn't nervous. They were annoyed. Actors are sensitive to schedule changes. They prepare mentally for their scenes. They create emotional momentum. When rehearsals get shifted, it throws their internal rhythm off. So the early morning mood quietly soured. But still, everyone was trying to stay professional. At least until 9:02 a.m. Because that's when the energy shifted again, this time dramatically. One of the grips walking in from a loading bay stopped mid-step. He turned to his colleague and said, "Why are there cars lined up outside the gate? We're not expecting any deliveries." Cars? No. SUVs? Yes. Black ones. Multiple. Parked too neatly to be coincidence. Another crew member peeked out a side exit. That's when they saw the lenses. Camera lenses. Long-distance paparazzi cameras pointed toward the studio entrance. And that's when the first domino fell. Understand something. Paparazzi don't appear randomly on private property. They don't accidentally show up at closed studio lots. They don't invest time and travel to capture a gamble. Someone tipped them off. Someone gave them a location. Someone provided a timetable. And since Meghan was the only public-facing name in the cast scheduled that day, the conclusion clicked instantly. But even then, crew members didn't panic. They assumed PR had coordinated something. Except PR hadn't. PR was blindsided. At least 5 staff members immediately raised alarms via walkie-talkie. Studio security rushed to the gates. They tried to determine whether the photographers had trespassed or were shooting from public areas. But what really bothered insiders wasn't the paparazzi themselves. It was what their presence meant. Because paparazzi don't just take photos, they disrupt rhythm. Actors feel self-conscious. Crew feels watched. Directors feel intruded upon. It creates a psychological fog that's impossible to ignore. And Jason Orley hates distraction more than anything. By 9:15 a.m., the tension became visible. Lighting technicians weren't focusing on the rigging anymore. Wardrobe assistants started rushing their prep because they didn't know if the schedule would change again. A few actors pulled out their phones and exchanged worried messages. And then one of the PAs muttered something that would become the phrase of the day. Something's happening. We're not prepared. But what happened next cemented that feeling permanently. At 9:27 a.m., 3 men in dark suits walked through the main corridor. Not studio security. Not production staff. Not executives. No badges. No identification. No clipboards. No communication with crew. They walked with the slow, heavy, watchful presence of private security contractors who believed nothing else in the building mattered except the person they were prepping for. 2 minutes later, another pair arrived. Then another. A makeup artist described it as watching shadows form into a wall. Some crew members laughed nervously, asking if someone important needed an escort. But the more people appeared, the less anyone felt like joking. One intern whispered, "Are we filming a Secret Service movie today?" Another replied, "Maybe they're doing background checks on all of us." No one knew the truth. Not yet. At 9:38 a.m., the assistant director approached them and attempted to introduce himself. The men didn't respond. They didn't shake his hand. They didn't even acknowledge him. They simply nodded at each other and repositioned themselves along the hallway, forming a border. A border for what? That was the question that kept repeating through the room. Then came the biggest pre-Meghan moment of the morning. A door slammed. A loud slam, the kind that echoes through metal walls. A runner sprinted across the soundstage. People turned. Someone whispered, "What was that?" Another said, "She's here." But she wasn't. Not yet. What the runner had seen was one of Meghan's personal team members, her assistant, possibly her handler, entering the building ahead of her to prepare her entrance. Prepare her entrance? That phrase spread through the set like wildfire. Prepare her entrance? For rehearsals? The mood shifted again, this time from confusion to irritation. Actors exchanged looks. Crew members rolled their eyes behind clipboards. The director exhaled sharply and muttered something under his breath. But irritation was nothing compared to what was coming next. Because at 9:47 a.m., according to 3 separate insiders, something happened that changed the atmosphere instantly. The hallway lights flickered, not because of a power outage, not because of a technical glitch, but because a large group of bodies, guards, assistants, coordinators, suddenly stepped into the narrow corridor, blocking the light. And behind them, somewhere behind them, was Meghan. They could hear her voice. Not clearly, just the tone. Confident. Clipped. The tone of someone being briefed on something important. People turned their heads toward the hallway. Someone whispered, "She's coming." Another muttered, "Brace yourselves." But it wasn't her arrival that shocked everyone. It was the energy. The entire hallway filled with a kind of buzzing tension. Like static electricity right before a lightning strike. You know that feeling? Where you don't know what's going to happen, but you know something is. Another assistant director tried to walk past the guards to reach the stage entrance. They stopped him, blocked him, wouldn't let him through. He held up his badge, genuinely confused. They still didn't move. He walked away shaking his head. Later he allegedly said, "I've worked on sets with A-listers who have won every award under the sun. Not once have I been physically blocked by a personal guard. And he wasn't the only one. A crew member carrying lighting gels tried to squeeze past. Blocked. A script supervisor attempted to get to her desk. Blocked. A production coordinator tried to greet the new arrivals. Ignored. This wasn't a celebrity arrival. This was a takeover. But the strangest part wasn't the guards or the assistants. It was the silence in the studio.